April 23, 1945, 11:45 a.m. Deep beneath the limestone cliffs of Haigerloch, Germany. The air is thick with the smell of damp earth and ozone. You can hear the rhythmic, metallic clink, clink, clink of Allied picks hitting the cave walls. But inside the secret laboratory, there is only a deafening, terrifying silence. Here, suspended from a heavy iron crane, hangs a lattice of 664 uranium cubes. It looks more like a strange, occult chandelier than a weapon of war. This is the VIII nuclear reactor, the miracle that was supposed to burn the world to a cinder and save the thousand-year Reich. But there is no fire here today, only cold, gray metal. General Leslie Groves' Alsos mission soldiers burst into the chamber, their boots echoing against the concrete. They expected to find a son being born in a basement. Instead, they find a tomb. The scientists are gone. The fuel is buried in a nearby field. The great German Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon that kept millions of Germans hoping while their cities turned to ash, was nothing more than a lead-lined dream. How did the world's most advanced military machine trade reality for science fiction? To understand the myth of the Wunderwaffe, you have to look past the steel and the blueprints. You have to feel the desperation of a regime that realized, too late, that it was fighting a war of logistics with a strategy of magic. For Hitler and his inner circle, the miracle weapon wasn't just a tactical goal, it was a religious necessity. As the Allied ring tightened around Berlin, the propaganda shifted. It was no longer about the bravery of the Wehrmacht, it was about the secret being built in the mountains. Imagine being a German civilian in 1944. Your house is a pile of rubble, your sons are missing on the Eastern Front. But Goebbels' voice on the radio promises you a retaliation, a weapon so powerful it will make the heavens fall. You want to believe it. You have to believe it. The first of these retaliations was already screaming through the stratosphere. It was called the V-2, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. A masterpiece of engineering that moved so fast, 4 times the speed of sound, that you were dead before you even heard it coming. It was a technological miracle, yes, but as the first V-2 slammed into a residential street in London, the engineers in Peenemünde knew a dark truth that the public didn't. The miracle was bleeding them dry. Every V-2 rocket cost as much to build as 4 Tiger tanks. Every launch consumed thousands of gallons of precious fuel that the Luftwaffe desperately needed to defend the skies over Germany. For every person killed by a V-2, more people died building them in the horrific underground tunnels of Mittelbau-Dora. It was a weapon of the future, built by the slaves of the past, serving a present that no longer existed. But the V-2 was just the beginning. In the frantic workshops of Messerschmitt and Heinkel, things were getting even stranger. They were building a plane that didn't use a propeller, a plane that flew on a cocktail of volatile chemicals so corrosive they could dissolve a human pilot in seconds. The Me-163 Komet was coming, and with it, the realization that the line between a wonder weapon and a suicide pact had completely vanished. August 16, 1944, 11:10 a.m., Brandes Airfield, near Leipzig. You are strapped into a seat that feels more like an electric chair than a cockpit. Your heart hammers against your ribs, a frantic rhythm that matches the hissing sound coming from behind your head. Through the thick armored glass, the runway stretches out, shimmering in the summer heat. But you aren't looking at the horizon. You are looking at the small glass tubes on your dashboard. Beneath you, 2 liquids are about to meet: T-Stoff, a stabilized high-test peroxide, and C-Stoff, a mixture of hydrazine hydrate and methanol. On their own, they are lethal. Together, they don't just burn, they explode with a violence that defies physics. The ground crew, wearing rubberized suits that make them look like deep-sea divers, scurry away. They know the truth. If a single drop of T-stuff touches their skin, it will dissolve the flesh to the bone in seconds. This isn't just a plane. This is the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet. It is the only rocket-powered fighter to ever see combat, and today it is your only hope of stopping the Silver Whale B-17 bombers currently turning Germany into a graveyard. You pull the lever. The world doesn't just move, it shatters. A roar, louder than 1,000 thunderstorms, erupts behind you. You are pinned into your seat by a force so immense it feels like a giant's hand is crushing your chest. Within 2 minutes, you aren't just flying. Seneca's hell is beneath you, and you are at 30,000 feet, piercing the thin blue veil of the atmosphere at nearly 600 miles per hour. You see them. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, their silver wings glinting. They look stationary, frozen in time, because you are moving so fast the human brain can barely process the intercept. You have exactly 7 minutes of fuel, 7 minutes to save the Reich, 7 minutes to play God. But as you dive toward the bombers, closing the gap at Mach 0.8, the miracle begins to fail. The G-forces are so high that your vision tunnels into a dark pinprick. You pull the trigger on your 30mm Mk-108 weapons, designed to tear a wing off a bomber in a single hit. Thump, thump, thump. The recoil jars your teeth. And then, silence. The fuel is gone. The roar dies. In an instant, the world's most advanced interceptor becomes a 4,000-pound brick of wood and metal. You are now a glider, a silent, helpless target in a sky filled with angry Mustang P-51s. As you spiral down toward Brandis, sweat stinging your eyes, you realize the cruel irony of Hitler's Wunderwaffe. The Komet was supposed to sweep the skies clean. Instead, it killed more of its own pilots than it did Allied bombers. Some died when the landing skid snapped, others when the volatile fuel remnants leaked into the cockpit, literally melting the pilot into the seat. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, a triumph of rocket science, but it was a tactical disaster. While the engineers in the Luftwaffe High Command were obsessed with breaking the sound barrier, the Allies were doing something much simpler. They were building 10,000 average planes for every one miracle plane Germany produced. The Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring wanted a sword of lightning. What he got was a glass blade that shattered upon the first strike. Yet even as the Komet pilots were being buried in closed caskets, the propaganda machine in Berlin was already pivoting. If the miracle in the air couldn't win the war, then the miracle from the ground would. Far to the north, on the Baltic coast, a new sound was beginning to echo across the waves, a rhythmic, stuttering pulse that sounded like a giant heartbeat. The V-1 buzz bomb was ready, and it didn't need a pilot to die for it. At least not a German one. June 13, 1944, 4:18 a.m. A quiet residential street in Bethnal Green, London. The night is humid, the kind of heavy air that makes sleep difficult even without the sirens. You lie in your bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant, familiar hum of anti-aircraft fire. But then, a new sound cuts through the static of the night. It's a low, guttering growl, a rhythmic, mechanical throb that sounds like a motorcycle engine idling in the sky. Foot, 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 foot. You've heard every German bomber engine, from the Heinkel to the Junkers, but this is different. It's angry, it's metallic, and it's getting closer. You run to the window, and there, silhouetted against the moon, you see it. A small, cigar-shaped shadow with stubby wings and a trail of orange flame spitting from a tube on its back. It is the V-1 flying bomb,
the Vergeltungswaffe 1, the doodlebug. For a moment, you are transfixed by the sheer mechanical strangeness of it. But then, the most terrifying thing happens. The sound stops. The orange flame flickers and dies. The silence that follows is the loudest thing you have ever heard. In that silence, you know that somewhere in the dark sky above, a ton of high explosives has just begun its final, unpowered plunge toward the earth. You have exactly 12 seconds to find cover, 12 seconds to hope it chooses another street. This was Hitler's first true retaliation weapon. It wasn't a weapon designed to win a battle or destroy a factory. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated psychological trauma. Unlike a bomber, which had a human pilot who might feel fear or mercy, the V-1 was a robot. It didn't care about the weather. It didn't care about the darkness. It just kept coming. Technically, the V-1 was a marvel of cheap engineering. While the MiG-163 Komet was a Ferrari of the skies, the V-1 was a lawnmower with a death wish. Its Argus AS-014 pulse-jet engine was so simple it could be built by unskilled labor in a matter of hours. It used a primitive gyroscopic autopilot to stay on course and a tiny propeller on its nose that counted the revolutions until it reached its target distance. When the counter hit 0, the elevators flipped, the engine cut out, and the buzz bomb became a silent guillotine. By the end of the summer, over 10,000 of these machines had been launched from the French coast. The Allied response was frantic. They moved entire divisions of anti-aircraft guns to the coast. They even discovered a terrifyingly cinematic way to stop them. RAF Spitfire and Tempest pilots would fly alongside the V-1, match its speed, and gently tuck their own wingtip under the missile's wing. With a sharp flick of the stick, they would flip the V-1 over, crashing its gyroscope and sending it spiraling into the empty countryside. But for every V-1 flipped into a field, another found a hospital, a school, or a crowded market. Yet, as the smoke cleared over London, the cold, hard math of the Wunderwaffe was failing again. To the Nazi High Command, the V-1 was a success because it tied up Allied resources. But to the German soldier shivering in a trench in Normandy, the V-1 was a ghost. It didn't stop the Allied tanks. It didn't sink the supply ships. It was a massive industrial effort, millions of man-hours and tons of precious steel poured into a weapon that had a 0% chance of changing the outcome of the war. The Nazi leadership, however, was past the point of logic. They were now addicted to the Great Leap. If a small robot bomb couldn't stop the Allies, perhaps a giant of steel and fire could. While the V-1 was terrorizing civilians, Hitler was turning his eyes away from the sky and back toward the mud of the battlefield. He didn't just want a tank, he wanted a fortress on tracks. Something so heavy it would crack the very roads it drove on. Something so massive that the laws of engineering would practically scream in protest. Deep in the Krupp factories, the blueprints for the Panzer VIII Maus were being unrolled, a 188-ton monster that made the legendary Tiger tank look like a toy. It was the ultimate expression of the Wunderwaffe delusion, the belief that if you couldn't outsmart your enemy, you could simply outsize them. But as the first prototype of the Maus attempted to move, the German engineers were about to learn a lesson that the V-1 and the Komet had already tried to teach them. In the theater of total war, a miracle is often just a very expensive way to lose. And the Allies weren't just watching from a distance. They were closing in on the secret launch sites, and what they were about to find buried in the hills of northern France would make the V-1 look like a child's toy.
June 1944. Kummersdorf Proving Grounds, south of Berlin. The earth doesn't just shake, it groans.
You feel it first in the soles of your boots, a deep, rhythmic thud that seems to vibrate your very marrow. Then you hear the engine, a 1,200 horsepower Daimler-Benz beast that sounds like a chorus of dying dragons. Out of the dust and the exhaust smoke emerges a shape that defies military logic. It is a block of steel so massive it looks like a mountain decided to grow treads. This is the Panzer VIII Mouse. You stand next to it and feel small, not just physically small, but insignificantly human. Its armor is nearly 10 inches thick, thicker than the hull of many warships. Its main gun, a 128mm KWK-44, can vaporize any Allied tank from 2 miles away before they even know they're in a fight. It is the ultimate expression of Ferdinand Porsche's engineering genius and Adolf Hitler's obsession with size. But as the mouse tries to turn, the miracle vanishes. The tracks, wide as a man is tall, churn the soft earth into a muddy grave. The 188-ton monster sinks. It doesn't just get stuck, it anchors itself to the planet. You watch as the engineers frantically try to calculate how to get it across a bridge. They can't. There isn't a bridge in Europe strong enough to hold it. To cross a river, the mouse would have to drive underwater with a giant snorkel, a feat of engineering so complex it borders on the suicidal. The mouse was a bunker that forgot it was supposed to be a tank. While the Soviet Union was flooding the plains with thousands of agile T-34s, Germany was wasting its dwindling steel and fuel on 2 prototypes that could barely crawl at 8 miles per hour. It was a weapon designed for a war of giants being built by a nation that was running out of shadows to hide in. But Hitler's eyes weren't just on the ground. He was still looking across the English Channel, frustrated that his buzz bombs weren't enough. He wanted more. He wanted a gun so large it could fire from the hills of France and hit the heart of London every 6 seconds. September 1944, Mimiec, France. Deep inside a limestone hill, Allied bombers are dropping tall boys, 5-ton earthquake bombs, but they aren't hitting a factory. They are hitting a ghost. Buried 100 feet underground is the V3 cannon, also known as the London gun. Imagine a barrel 430 feet long. It doesn't look like a traditional cannon. It looks like a giant centipede made of steel. Along the side of the barrel are dozens of side chambers filled with explosives. As the shell travels up the tube, these charges fire in sequence, kicking the projectile faster and faster until it exits the muzzle at a terrifying velocity. It was designed to rain 3,000 shells a day on London. It was a masterpiece of multi-chamber physics. It was also a total failure. The vibrations from the sequential explosions were so violent they kept tearing the barrels apart during testing. The logistics of keeping such a monster fed with shells and explosive charges was a nightmare. And yet, thousands of slave laborers were worked to death to carve out the tunnels to house it. The V3 never fired a single shot on London. By the time the engineers were close to a solution, the Allied tall boys had collapsed the tunnels, burying the London gun forever. Among the pilots sent to destroy this site was Joseph Kennedy Jr., the older brother of the future U.S. president. He died when his explosives-laden plane blew up over the English coast, a tragic sacrifice to stop a weapon that likely would have destroyed itself anyway. The Wunderwaffe program had become a black hole. It was sucking in Germany's best scientists, its last reserves of tungsten and chrome, and its most precious resource, time. While the Allies were perfecting radar, proximity fuses, and the mass production of reliable hardware, the Nazi leadership was chasing dragons. But as 1944 bled into 1945, there was one final miracle left. It wasn't a tank, and it wasn't a buried gun. It was a silver needle that flew so high the stars were its only companions. It was the weapon that would win the war for Hitler, or, as the scientists in the Baltic marshes secretly hoped, it would be the weapon that gave them a ticket to the future. The V-2 rocket was about to enter its final, deadliest phase, and this time there would be no Spitfires to flip it over.
September 8, 1944, 6:43 p.m. Staveley Road, Chiswick, West London. The evening is quiet. The buzz bombs have slowed down, and for the first time in weeks, the people of London feel a tentative, fragile sense of peace. You are walking home, perhaps thinking about dinner or the static-filled news on the BBC. There is no siren. There is no guttural roar of a pulse-jet engine. There is only the soft rustle of leaves in the autumn wind. Then the world turns inside out. A deafening double crack, boom, boom, shatters the air. One moment, Staveley Road is a row of brick houses. The next, a crater 30 feet wide has swallowed 3 of them. There was no warning, no shadow in the sky, no chance to dive for a cellar. You stand there, ears ringing, dust coating your lungs like powdered lead, looking up at the clear twilight sky. You see nothing. The V-2 rocket has arrived. While the V-1 was a buzz bomb, the V-2 was a silent executioner. Because it traveled at Mach 4, 4 times the speed of sound, the sound of its flight arrived long after the rocket itself had already detonated. It was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a 46-foot-tall needle of steel and liquid oxygen that climbed 50 miles into the blackness of the upper atmosphere before falling back to Earth like a vengeful thunderbolt from Zeus. At the heart of this miracle was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant, ambitious engineer who didn't care much for Nazi ideology but cared deeply about reaching the stars. To him, the V-2, or the A-4 as he called it, was a prototype for a moon rocket. To Hitler, it was the only way left to hurt an enemy he could no longer reach with planes. Inside the rocket, a masterpiece of fluid dynamics was at work. A steam-driven turbopump, spinning at 4,000 RPM, forced 3 tons of alcohol and 5 tons of liquid oxygen into a combustion chamber every minute. It was the most complex machine ever built by man. But as you look at the smoking ruins of Chiswick, the Wunderwaffe math is once again revealed as a hollow lie. For all its technological majesty, the V-2 was a strategic failure of catastrophic proportions. Each rocket cost roughly the same as a long-range bomber, yet it could only carry a single 1-ton warhead. Once fired, it was gone forever. It couldn't be reused. It couldn't be aimed with enough precision to hit a specific factory or a bridge. It could only hit a city. More importantly, the V-2 program was so expensive that it cost the German war effort more than the Manhattan Project cost the United States. But the true darkness of the V-2 wasn't in its physics, it was in its shadow. Deep inside the Harz Mountains, in a nightmare called Mittelbau Dora, thousands of prisoners from the Buchenwald concentration camp were being worked to death in freezing, lightless tunnels. They were building the miracle by hand, under the whips of the SS. It is a chilling historical fact that more people died building the V-2 rockets than were killed by them as weapons. The Wunderwaffe wasn't just a military obsession, it was a human meat grinder. By early 1945, the V-2 launch sites in France and the Netherlands were being overrun. Von Braun and his team were no longer dreaming of London or the moon, they were dreaming of survival. They knew that the miracle they had built was the most valuable currency in the world. As the Red Army closed in from the east and the Americans from the west, the great scientists of the Reich began to play a dangerous game. Who should they give the future to?
The Wunderwaffe era was ending in fire and rubble, but a new era was being born in the crates of stolen blueprints and captured rocket engines. The Nazi superweapons had failed to save the Thousand-Year Reich, but they had succeeded in something else. They had shown the world that the next war would be fought not with soldiers, but with the very atoms that held the universe together. And as the last V2 fell, the race for the ultimate Wunderwaffe, the one that would truly change the world forever, had only just begun.
May 2nd, 1945, 2:30 p.m. The Bavarian Alps, near the Austrian border. The war in Europe is dying. In the streets of Berlin, the air is a suffocating shroud of brick dust and the iron scent of blood. But here, amidst the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Obersalzberg, the air is piercingly cold and silent. You are a soldier in the U.S. 44th Infantry Division, moving cautiously through the pine trees, expecting a final desperate ambush from the Alpine fortress Hitler always bragged about. Instead, you find a man on a bicycle. He is young, with a cast on his left arm, and a nervous, calculating look in his eyes. He doesn't look like a fanatic. He looks like a businessman who just lost his biggest client. This is Magnus von Braun, and his message is simple. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender to the Americans. A few miles away, hidden in a mountain lodge, sits Werner von Braun and his elite team of engineers. They aren't surrounded by miracle weapons anymore. They are surrounded by crates. Thousands of tons of blueprints, flight data, and specialized components, the entire intellectual skeleton of the Wunderwaffe program. They had made a choice. They knew the Soviets would want their brains for vengeance, but the Americans would want their brains for the future. As you enter the underground factories of central Germany in the following days, the miracle is finally stripped bare. You see rows of jet engines for the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, rusting on assembly lines. You find the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, a jet made of wood because Germany had run out of aluminum. You find blueprints for the Sanger Silbervogel, an antipodal bomber designed to skip across the atmosphere and drop a bomb on New York City. It is a museum of what-ifs. The tragedy of the Wunderwaffe wasn't that the technology didn't work. Much of it did. The Me-262 was faster than anything the Allies had. The V2 was a triumph of physics. The problem was that the Nazi leadership believed technology could replace strategy. They believed a miracle could compensate for a lack of fuel, a lack of pilots, and a lack of moral ground. They spent their last resources building the 21st century's weapons to fight a 20th century war. As the crates are loaded onto American trucks under Operation Paperclip, the German people are left in the ruins. The retaliation Goebbels promised never came to save them. The miracle in the mountains was just a smokescreen for a collapsing empire. The V2 rockets that once rained terror on London are now being repainted with American stars and Soviet hammers. The Wunderwaffe myth was finally dead, but for the rest of the world, the age of the rocket had only just begun.